So what we want to look at today is David Miller's argument, his particular position, how he argues for it regarding immigration, and how he thinks that really from a moral perspective, in Western societies like ours, immigration itself should be quite limited. Obviously, this is an issue, this is a topic that's very controversial. It's not only politically controversial in our era, right, in the day in which we're living in right now, every time an election rolls around, at least a federal election, because it's at the federal or the central government level, I should say, that that immigration is a policy issue. Right? In our country, the individual states really don't regulate or really have no say when it comes to immigration policy. It's something that the federal government does, which is why it's a big issue, or at least that's why when we hear about it every time there's a federal election. But it's not just been one. I think it's fair to say, not just been one that's been um, a huge issue of late. Actually, when you look into it, a lot of the rhetoric, um, legitimate and illegitimate, good and bad rhetoric that surrounds this issue is about the same as it's been for the past 40 years. It's most people I think don't realize that a lot of the arguments being made today were made about 40 years ago when they started popping up, when this started becoming a very um, important issue for particular constituencies in American politics. So it definitely is today, and so I think it's definitely something to talk about and to think about from the perspective of moral philosophy. So in this particular lecture, we're looking at David Miller. You've read his article. It's pretty good stuff. Good writer. You may have been thinking through it, and so we're going to analytically go through it here today, as we do with all of the articles and issues that we look at and have been looking at in this course. So why David Miller? Well, David Miller is an incredibly important voice when it comes to issues regarding social and political philosophy, specifically thinking about social and political philosophy in terms of the nation state. He's been at Oxford in England for many years, political philosopher there, and he's primarily known for his work on nationalism. And it's out of this work on nationalism that he gives us this moral argument, this ethical argument on the restrictions of immigration and why he thinks that that is a morally good thing. It is the morally right thing to do to restrict immigration. I'll say so. Okay, so the question then is, how does he connect his ideas on nationalism to immigration restriction? Miller some years ago wrote this book. I remember when I was in grad school, I read it. I took a course actually on modern nationalism, and this book he wrote is entitled "On Nationality." And in this book, what Miller argues is that nationalism, and of course, nationalism is a very hard thing to define because it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, we might say that there are very bad kinds of forms of nationalism. For instance, I mean, one example of that would be, which doesn't right, exist formally in ways like it used to in some places, like Nazi Germany, but this sort of white nationalism, this sort of Aryan nationalism, that is that this idea that a true nation is one that is defined as everyone who has, pure white skin and pure blue eyes, who are tied together in terms of all these sort of genetic features that they have, which is supposed to be um, um, is supposed to point to something more essential, deeper, that is better, right, than everybody else. Right, that's a bad form of nationalism. Um, Most forms of nationalism, that, and by that what we mean is, what is the nation itself? Because you can't really say that a nation is the same thing as a country. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that because I don't want to really take us off a direction here. But I think we need to kind of understand this basic point that Miller's building off of. If we're trying to find what a nation is, we do know that some nations um, extend beyond the mere borders of a state or the borders of a country. Think about various sort of Native American nations, a nation of people um, who themselves don't necessarily live within these really tightly knit borders of a particular jurisdiction. or nations of people in various places like in Asia or in Africa, nations, cultures of people who don't themselves neat, fit neatly into the jurisdictional states in Africa, for instance. I mean, most of the African states themselves were artificially drawn up by British imperialists many, many years ago, right? Not really taking into account the sort of cultural and language connections of people groups on that continent many, many years ago. So we don't want to conflate the nation as a country, right? In a sense, there's two kinds of different things. Um, so what is a nation, and then what is nationalism? Well, many people define a nation different ways. I gave you the example of like a white nationalism, right? This idea that the nation or the pure nation is one that has all these sorts of features. We might say also that certain kinds of nations are bound together by a language, like language might be the particular tie that a nation has. That might be really the essence of what the nation is, people who share the same heart language. Um, it has also been the case over the years where a nation has been tied together through a particular religion or philosophy or ideology about themselves, how they identify themselves. So, right, there's different ways of thinking about um, what it is that makes a nation. What is the thread, the key thread that brings a nation together as one? Um, my personal opinion, what I think what makes the United States a nation, because we're a very diverse place. Um, you drive all over the country and you will find people, even though they may speak English, who have different ideas about the world, maybe speak their English a little bit differently, have different slang, build their houses differently than the way we build them here. Architecture is a little different, right? There's all kind of different religions, different everything, different dishes to eat. I mean, there's all kinds of different things about the country. We're a very diverse place. We really are a nation of immigrants, which is an important thing to keep in mind, I think, especially later as we think about some of these claims that Miller will be making. So what is it that ties us together, that makes us a nation? And really, the only one common thread, frankly, that we have, I think that's fairly universal, is this creed that we have, this creed that is part of our Declaration of Independence, this creed, which really is a belief. It's a proposition we believe in that forms the basis of our Constitution, um, for liberty, for freedom, um, a government for the people, by the people, right? This sort of thing. I think that's really it, because everything else is sort of up for grabs when it comes to individuals and how they think of themselves and how they think of the world in which they live in. Okay, so the next question then is if that's what our national identity is, it's this creed, let's say in our case, the United States of America, then what would be a nationalism? Well, a nationalism would be sort of the ways in which, and our ideologies and our beliefs and our philosophies that bolster that uphold that in a sense that lives that out. Um, we would think, in other words, that living that out and promoting that would be a good thing if we were nationalists in that way. So how does all that now tie into Miller's work on nationalism? Well, Miller thinks that nationalism is a very good thing because what it does is it points to a national identity that all kinds of people have with one another in a place like the United States. What is it that connects me and makes me the same kind of person at this national level here where I live in North Alabama with someone who lives in northern Maine, or someone who lives in Portland, Oregon, or someone who lives in Yuma, Arizona, or someone who lives in Corpus Christi, Texas, or uh, I don't know, Omaha, Nebraska, right? What is it that makes us all Americans? What is it that makes us all the same people? It's this creed, let's say, okay? And we all have a fondness to this creed. We live this creed out every day of our lives. And that's how we are able to identify with one another. We are able to share this national identity and thus have a kind of unity there. And Miller thinks that that's really important. That's a good thing morally to have. It's a good thing morally to encourage and to cultivate, because what it does is it helps us sort of reveal or helps us understand our shared commitments to one another, our shared obligations to one another, and the duties that are derived out of that. And thus, out of that sort of feeling, that connection, that national identity we have with one another, we are able then to support really important moral things like justice, like democracy, um, um, and among other things. So, in a sense, I think it's fair to say that for Miller, he sees nationalism, which really is the recognition of a national identity that we share with one another. He sees that as really crucial, as really important for achieving ethical stuff, justice, democracy, so on and so forth, right? We're able, out of these obligations that we have to one another via our national identity that we share with one another, to achieve all kinds of good things for one another. In other words, it's a good thing. National identity, nationalism is a very good tool. It's a very good conduit for achieving morality um, at at the state level or at the national level. Um, so that being the case for Miller, right? That's sort of what grounds and what undergirds his position here. Then how does immigration play into that? Well, basically, and here's basically the gist of what he thinks, because nationalism, national identity is such a good thing, right? It's really important because it helps us achieve moral goods. Then we need to protect that. And so he thinks then that nations really have a right, and maybe even more so, maybe an obligation, but we'll talk about it in terms of a right here, that nations have a right to restrict immigration in order to protect that identity, thus protecting themselves, protecting what um, helps them be moral, if we want to put it that way. So let's get into sort of the nuts and bolts of his argument, or of his position, we should say. There's several arguments um, that he looks at, that he talks about. What we're going to do first here is sort of follow. Well, what we're going to do is follow the particular pattern that Miller himself presents. And we will do this by, first of all, looking at the three bad arguments that he gives um, for the right to migrate. In other words, these are three arguments that he has read other people make, and these other people seem to be arguing for the sort of absolute right that everyone has to migrate to different places around the globe. And he thinks, however, that these are very bad arguments. Well, what's the first bad argument? The first bad argument is this sort of claim that freedom includes one's right to move and reside in other states. That is, to really be free, to have a sort of freedom that is bound to and that is part and parcel of our autonomy as human beings, is the kind of freedom that we have that's unrestricted to move and reside wherever it is that we want to move. Obviously, here in the United States, there's a sense in which that's kind of true, right? Within this particular country, I could pack up and move somewhere else tomorrow if I wanted to, right? There's a sense of unrestricted freedom there, that we are used to, and that we know that happens because, hey, people move different states, different places all over the country all the time, and we do it for all kinds of interest, right? There's all kinds of reasons why we do that. Some people do it in order to practice their religion more faithfully. That may not be as much of an issue now as, say, it has been in the past, but it still does happen. Think, for instance, of places in the country where particular religions are how would I put this? Where there's more of a center of gravity, if I can put it that way. Um, for instance, I think of where I grew up near Detroit, Michigan, or really in Detroit, Michigan, where there was a very heavy Catholic, Roman Catholic presence. Um, Living in the South, not so much. I mean, it is here, and I want to be careful. I want to say that Catholicism does not exist here, but not to the extent that it does there. And so, it's been interesting talking to people and seeing how that, even for that reason, right? They move around. They locate where they can better practice their religion. It's something that people have done for years and years and years. Um, for speech, right? To exercise free speech. Some places might be a little bit more amenable to that than others regarding the kind of speech one wants to speak, one wants to express. For work, oh yeah, I mean that's the reason why I live here, frankly, is because of work here that I've been able to secure. Think of my own family's history for the last 100 years. We've been somewhat nomads. We go back to uh, Appalachia, and then in the mid 20th century, right? Grandparents and great grandparents moved to industrial centers like Pittsburgh and Detroit and Chicago and places like that to find work. Interestingly enough, a lot of my generation now has left those industrial centers and have come back south to find work. So it's what we do, right? It's what people have always done. And freedom of association, right? We move, we go to places in order to associate in ways that we think is really important for flourishing in our lives, right? So there's a sense in which, right, we understand that there's some truth to this, that indeed being a free people means we have the right to move and reside wherever we want to in order to secure these interests that we have. But here's what Miller says about that. Fair enough. However, that really doesn't include the entirety of the Earth's surface. Right? A little bit dramatic here in putting it that way, but he's trying to be very technical. In other words, there is not a sort of unrestricted absolute freedom that we have to do this whenever we want to for whatever reason that we have. All right, let's think of some examples here. First of all, you don't have the right to inhabit the space that someone else currently does. If we were in a live classroom right now, I could illustrate this by going to someone in the classroom who's sitting there and saying, what if I were to push you off of the chair that you are sitting on and currently inhabit that little bit of space that you are inhabiting right now? Don't I have the right to do that? And of course, you're going to say, well, no, Dr. Ball, you don't have the right to do that. And indeed, if you touched me and did that, then I would file a complaint. You would probably get fired. And I would say, yeah, I probably would. So I will not do that. I kind of like my job. Definitely like my paycheck. Kind of like my job. No, I'm just kidding. I do love my job. Um, that would be a bad thing to do. So why would I want to do that? Well, I don't want to do that. I don't have the right to say, hey, I like the space that you are currently using, that your body is currently taking up, and so I'm going to take that right now. That's called assault and battery. It's not a good thing. So I don't have a right to inhabit that space, do I? Well, what about someone's property, without their consent? What if I wanted to take my dogs out for a long walk and I just go out here behind my place and I just start traipsing through some of these farmers' cornfields and hay fields around here? Right? We just start walking. Well, they probably wouldn't mind. I'll be honest. They probably wouldn't mind. I mean, they might get a little bit fishy, might be wanting to, or might find it to be kind of fishy. They maybe be worried I'd be hunting without asking them, which is definitely a no-no. So they might not mind, but I don't have a right just to do that, to go traipsing along and moving myself across other people's property that they legitimately own without their permission. And probably I wouldn't want to do that. I might get shot. Uh, yeah, so I probably shouldn't do that around here. Um, so again, it's probably not a big deal, but it's not that I have a right to that. I mean, I really don't, unless I do ask permission. That makes sense. Public roadways, right? I don't have a right to inhabit public roadways. I don't have a right to drive up and down the road that I live on, frankly. Um, Legally speaking, these are called public privileges. I have a privilege that the state gives me to do that, so long as I meet the minimum requirements that the state puts out there, what the state requires, such as passing an exam for driving a motor vehicle. As long as I meet the requirements regarding eyesight, for instance, legally I'm not allowed to drive without my glasses. I'm supposed to always have my glasses when I drive. Not necessarily that my vision is all that bad, but I think the last time I took the test, the eye test, I had my glasses on when I took that test. Um, so yeah, I kind of messed myself up there. But anyway, it's no big deal. I wear them all the time anyway, right? So minimum requirements like that the state puts on me, right? So it's not absolute unrestricted freedom there. Public parks after hours. It's not the sort of thing I'd want to do anyway. I don't think is go hang out in a kid's playground at 11 p.m. But anyway, I don't have the right to do that. So we get a sense of how this works, right? That even though we tend to think of ourselves as having the freedom to move, to reside, to go wherever we want to move our bodies to, it's not an absolute freedom in that way, is it? Right? There are all kinds of restrictions that we put upon ourselves regarding that. And what Miller wants to say is that all these kinds of regulations that I've just talked about, that he's just talked about, what they do is really they just prove that the right to freedom that we have is not absolute, although it's sufficiently provided for. In other words, the state in which we live really does provide for a sufficient amount of freedom, a sufficient amount of being able to move ourselves physically wherever it is that we want to go for the most part, right? In other words, we're not um, unjustly restricted um, by the state. In other words, the state doesn't prohibit us from doing the kinds of things, frankly, we need to do in order to survive and flourish. Right? We have a lot of freedom to do what we want to do. So that's sufficiently provided for. Well, but somebody might come back and ask, well, what if I live in a state that does not protect my interests? And of course, by a state here, Miller means a nation state, right? A country, not necessarily one of the 50 states in the United States, but I guess that could apply as well. But he's thinking of places such as in maybe third world countries or countries where there is a dictatorial regime that vastly prohibits and vastly unjustly um, limits people's freedom. What if you live in a place like North Korea, for instance, that definitely is not protecting your interests and your right to a sufficient amount of freedom to live your life freely as an autonomous agent? What there? Then do you have a right to go somewhere else? Well, maybe, but what Miller wants to say is that whatever right that is really a sort of a remedy, right? In other words, it's a remedial right that you have. It's a right to go to somewhere where the remedy is to sufficiently provide for freedom, just based on your basic human rights as a person, right? It's not about meeting people's personal preferences in that case. Rather, it's about providing a remedy to sufficiently provide for people's freedom. So that's the first bad argument and his response to that bad argument. Well, what about bad argument number two? Well, some people will argue, secondly, that the right to exit one's state implies the right to enter other states. Again, here we're talking about countries. So let's say that I have a right to leave the United States. And I do have a right to leave the United States. And it's been kind of interesting in the last few years noticing that how the data has been showing that a lot of people, a lot of rich people have been leaving the United States in order to sort of protect their fortunes from what they have seen to be sort of unjust tax codes as they have been changed and modified over the years. So they will renounce their citizenship and go to other countries that have more favorable tax laws and tax policies. So the United States will let you um, exit. However, what these people here in argument number two, or for Miller, bad argument number two, what the people who make this argument think, or what they claim, is that it's a sort of logical necessity here that if I have a right to exit my state, then necessarily that implies a right to enter, a right to immigrate to another one. Okay. Now, of course, the right to exit is important, as I just noted. Right, it happens in this country. Um, Indeed, I think it's sort of a wake-up call personally for the sorts of tax policies that we have, because frankly, right, we have a huge incentive in our country to keep people happy, to keep people working, to keep people here so that they can be taxpayers, especially as all these stimulus packages and all these other things that the government does to spend money. And if you ever look at what the national debt is, it's mind-blowing, the trillions of dollars in debt that we are um, to people around the world. Um, I mean, it's really not funny in a lot of ways. It's pretty scary. Um, Maybe I will be dead and gone by the time it actually uh, that the future generations have to deal with it. And so maybe that's the one saving grace on me and our generation, right? Maybe we won't have to deal with it. I definitely do not look forward to the day when we have to. Um, so anyway, what I'm saying is, right, we have a good incentive there, namely debt, a lot of debt, to keep people happy, to keep people paying taxes. Um, to pay for all the stuff that we pay for in this country. So having a right to exit is sort of leverage that people have against us, that our citizens have against us, right? Hey, make for a better country to live in, or else I'm leaving. I'm going somewhere else. It's sort of like, okay, well, we should revisit the policies. We should make this more amenable for people. So the right to exit is important there. It's also important because maybe not necessarily in this country right now, but in a lot of places around the world, uh, living conditions, um, even standard of living, can become very and is very intolerable. Right? There are some places around the world where it's just very difficult to live well, um, and so just being able to leave is really important. It's really important. I know for my family, a few hundred years ago, in the mid 17th century, when my 14th great grandfather, um, James Ball, came from England and settled in Maryland and Northern Virginia, right, for a better life, where he was living at the time in this particular region of England. It becomes somewhat intolerable for religious dissenters, as well as for others, and so it was crucial to be able to go somewhere else where he could live well. How does Miller respond to that? Well, he responds to this argument sort of in the same way that he responded to the first bad argument, as he puts it, that sure, these are important things, but it's not an absolute right that you have then to enter some other state just because you have the right to exit, the one that you're actually in. As he puts it, the right to exit entails only the right to enter a state that's willing to take you, not the state of your choice. So if I have a right to exit the United States, that does not entail that I have the right to go wherever I want to. Rather, all it entails is that I have the right to go into a place that gives me the green light and says, yeah, come here. And this makes sense, right? I mean, we have all kinds of rights that we are able to exercise only when there are others who are willing to cooperate with us. For instance, right, I have the right to do a business transaction with you, um, only if you want to actually do that business transaction with me, right? If you got something for sale online, on like an online trader blog or something, and I'm like, hey, I want to buy this from you. I reach out and send you a message. Do I have the absolute right to purchase that from you? Well, no. Um, Only if you sell it to me, right? If we cooperate in this sort of business transaction. Um, or you might even think of sexual relationships like that, right? I mean, do I have the right or do you have the right? Does anybody have the right to have sex with anybody they want to have sex with? Let's be honest. No, right? Uh, they have to be willing to, right? The other partner has to consent to it as well, right? That's just common sense stuff that makes a lot of sense when we put it in that perspective. And that's Miller's point here, that sure, we have rights to engage with people, to go where we want to go into the state that we want to go, only insofar as they actually let us in. Bad argument number three, and this is probably one of the more prominent arguments that sort of freeboarders, thinkers will make. And what they say is that there are lots of people who live in poor countries, right? Very poor places. Third world countries is often the term we use. Um, that somewhat describes that, but places where is incredible poverty. And so, as the argument goes, that people who live there, they have a claim on distributive justice that can be met only if they're allowed to migrate to rich states. Now, this is a very controversial uh, sort of concept anyway, that of distributive justice. Basically, the idea of distributive justice is that people make is that in virtue of one's humanity, in virtue of one's personhood, one has a right to live, and one has a claim on the right to live at a basic sort of minimal standard of living. In other words, if we live in a very prosperous place like the United States, everybody has a right to live at a sort of minimum standard of living, such that requires others to sort of chip in to distribute the wealth around a little bit, so that that can be done, that can be met for those who are in poverty, so that they can at least live at a certain level. Um, that's very controversial. There's a lot of people who think that that's wrong-headed, and that's fair enough. Of course, I think it's fair to say that in the United States today that this does exist. I mean, this is very much part and parcel of the policies that even in a very sort of conservative state like Alabama, right, policies that inform things like public education, um, like food stamps or food help, um, and how that gets done, right? These are all examples. I think public education is one of the better examples, really, of distributive justice, because even what a place like Alabama has said is that we're going to have public education, public schools that are available to everyone, and we're going to get everybody to pay for it, right? So that you don't have to. So this is a way in which monies get distributed so that every single person can take advantage of this particular public benefit. So think about it in something like that, right? So what Miller, or I'm sorry, what people who make this argument then say is that people who live in places that are very poor, that are not able to provide things like public education, or like 3 meals a day, basically, or something like that, is that they're not really able to be human in this sense, right? They're not really able to take a claim on this right that they have to justice, um, because where they live is so poor. Thus, they ought to be given the absolute right to migrate to other places where a basic level of justice in terms of distribution would be provided to them. Basically, another part of this argument then is to say that it's just incredibly unfair that there are all kinds of people who are condemned to poverty throughout all of their life due to no fault of their own, right? They've not done anything. It's just that circumstances have forced them to live in a place where there's corruption, where there's a tyrannical dictator, where, say, food and uh, aid has been given to them by Western countries like England and the US and Canada and Australia, for instance, France maybe, Germany, and all of that aid gets sort of hoarded up by those who are in power, and it doesn't actually go to the people to whom it was given and intended for. So, there's just really corrupt places like that keep people in poverty. And so these people should all be absolutely free to go and work wherever it is that they want to work, and do what they have to do to claim the sort of justice that at a very minimal level should be granted to them. Um, Miller responds to this particular criticism very interestingly, because what he wants to say is that, well, within particular societies, and societies there read nations, right? Because again, it's his nationalism that's informing his position here. Within a particular nation where people have special obligations to one another, where people have a particular kind of national identity to one another, sure, if you got to migrate, if you've got to move around, if you've got to leave uh, one locale and move somewhere else to work in your field and to live well, sure, we get that. That's what happens in societies like ours. But to do this globally, to do this worldwide, is very impractical, right? I mean, it's just very impractical to have free borders completely open so that anybody can go around everywhere they want to in order to claim sort of this minimum level of distributive justice that we say is guaranteed to them, or should be guaranteed to them. You just can't do that. And to think about it in this sort of global way is just pie in the sky stuff. Well, what really is the proper scope of distributive justice is a sort of an afterthought question that he raises, but he thinks that this sort of solves some of the problem here. Uh, that is because he's really sort of disagreeing with the premise that undergirds this particular argument. A lot of people say, well, that there are just huge disparities across the world when it comes to basic levels of distributive justice. And what Miller wants to say is, well, no, that's just not true. He seems to think that across the vast majority of the world, of the globe itself, that indeed the minimum level of distributive justice for people indeed is provided. The question is just, what are they going to do with that? But it's there if they'll lay hold on it. So those are three bad arguments that he considers, three bad arguments for the right to free and unrestricted immigration. Now, let's look at two reasons that he gives for why limiting immigration is really important, right? So he wants to say, he wants to think that it's a good thing to have limits on immigration. Well, why? Again, right? This is coming out of his view on the importance of national identity, the importance of nationalism, how it's critical, how it's a really good thing for us to be bound together with this kind of identity. And so, why would it be important to limit who can take hold of that particular national identity? In other words, why is it a good thing to restrict it, to not let everybody simply uh, take part and come into that identity that we share? Well, two reasons he gives. First of all, to protect a common public culture. Indeed, he thinks that this is crucial. It's the kind of common public culture that, again, is the sort of one of the aspects of the ties that bind us together as a nation, a shared culture that we have. Whereas even in the United States, that particular thread is more of a creed, as I talked about earlier. It's really the documents, it's the beliefs that we have that are embodied in the documents like the Constitution and like the Declaration of Independence. But nonetheless, that's what our public culture uh, is built on, is surrounded by. So this public culture that we have really does constitute the political identity that we have as citizens. And it really, right, is important for serving the function that we have of undergirding or supporting our democracy um, and all kinds of social goals that we have. The public culture is just crucial in that way. It's how we're able to identify with one another and exercise the obligations that we have to one another in virtue of being of the same nation, of having the same nationality in this sense. Well, why is this an issue, right? Why is this a big deal? It's a big deal because immigration is very much likely to change the public culture. And I think it's fair enough to say that indeed it has done that in places around the world. You might even say that in certain parts of the country in which we live, where there's been immigration and where immigrants have moved to particular locales in large numbers and large swaths of people, that even the public culture of those locales have changed to a certain extent, right? Well, why is that a bad thing for Miller? Or in other words, why is it important to not allow this to happen? Um, well, because as he puts it, the public culture that a state has is something that we as its citizens have an interest in controlling so that we may continue to shape the way that our nation develops. Um, out of the tradition, out of the long and hard fought battle, if we want to put it that way, over years and years and years and years that we have fought in order to achieve our vision of what a thriving, functional, moral society should be, right, over time. And mass immigration can almost change and upset that overnight, and it can cause a lot of conflict. So there's all kinds of things that are really important here. He mentioned several. I mean, think about the public culture that we have that's expressed in our language. This indeed might be a community's most important distinct characteristic, is the language that we have and that we share. And I would argue even sort of personally that the languages that we have around the world are very unique and very beautiful and very wonderful and worth preserving to a certain extent. I mean, um, take for example, what would be a good example of this? Take for example, in the American South, for instance, where we live here in Alabama, or where I'm speaking from right now. Um, there is a distinct Southern accent in this region of the state that is distinct from the accent that people have in the southern part of the state, as well as distinct from where my particular family is originally from, in East Kentucky and East Tennessee. Um, it's very distinct. Both are beautiful, both are wonderful. And I have noticed sort of in the past 20 years how that a lot of that has been flattened out. And it's not necessarily due to immigration. I think it's more so just due to pop culture. It's more so due to the amounts of television that people watch, especially children during their formative years of speaking. All the television they watch that's being piped in from places like New York and California is having an effect on their speech, such that a lot of the accent is no longer being preserved as it was in the past. And I don't know, I tend to think that's a loss really for us and for our regional particularities that in themselves are very beautiful. Um, also, trying to think. Oh, another example of this, for instance, of a place that has tried to keep this from happening. So in the country of Canada, there's a particular province called Quebec, and Quebec is the French-speaking province. Canada itself is pretty much English-speaking, but Quebec historically has always been French. And there are particular laws in Quebec that require the speaking and the teaching of French. Um, there are laws and regulations that only allow, like, I don't know, 15, 20% of English speaking television to be piped into that province, right? So they very much limit the amount of pop culture that comes in from the United States, for instance, as well as from places like Toronto or Vancouver in that country where they're primarily English speaking. Um, yeah, because what they see is a huge benefit in preserving language, right? It's a really important thing that is tied to their national identity, that is, as a nation of people, I guess within a nation, as Quebecers are sort of a nation of people within this country of Canada writ large. So yeah, they really don't want that to disappear. They don't want that to go away. They think that they do have an interest to protect and preserve that. All right, some other examples here. Think about aesthetics, for instance. Another one of the most beautiful things about diversity in terms of regional differences, cultural differences, is how people build things. Go check out, I'll give you an example here. Go check out a Presbyterian church that was built in the 18th century in Massachusetts. Go look at the church building. Then, I don't know, go up to Wisconsin and look at a Lutheran church that was built there in the mid 20th century. Um, Look at some Catholic churches that have been built in Arizona and New Mexico in the 18th, 19th century. They look very different, different architectural features. All of them are very unique. All of them are very much tied to sort of the regional cultural ideas that went into planning and building those kinds of structures. Maybe there's good reasons to protect that. What about rights? What about individual rights? This is a huge one that people often bring up. Um, that there's a sense in which, in a place like the United States, for instance, where there has been a hard fought battle over the years for women's rights. I'll just use that as an example. It wasn't always the case in this country that women could own private property. It wasn't always the case in this country that women could get their own credit cards if they were married women. They couldn't get their own credit cards without the permission of their husband, or that women could vote, right? That wasn't always the case. Um, you know, so on and so forth. There are certain parts of the world where women aren't even allowed to have a driver's license because they're women, because they're viewed as lesser. One of these places, for instance, is Saudi Arabia. I've probably mentioned it before in this course. It's a really good example. Well, and I should clarify, they actually just recently started allowing women to have driver's license. So if you're a female, you indeed can drive all over Saudi Arabia, right? This is fantastic for you. So, you know, book that trip today. Tour across the desert in a Mercedes. Um, so yeah, so here's the question, right? Where views of women are like that in places like Saudi Arabia, would it be a good thing? Would it be a morally permissible thing then, do we think, to just maybe bring 3 or 4 million immigrants from Saudi Arabia over here to the United States overnight and have them set up homes here in our communities? And our response to that's probably going to be, well, no, right? They're bringing all these ideas with them that we think are bad ideas, right? That we think are unjust, or would end up practically in bringing about unjust living conditions, right? Indeed, if they have convictions about women as somehow being lesser, as somehow being not having the value, not having um, personhood in the way that men do, right? We don't want to go back 100 years in the culture that we fought for women's rights. And in a sense, we would be doing that if we allowed mass immigration of people from places where they truly believe that women are lesser than men. So this is something that's really important. We have uh, very much we have an interest in protecting that sort of stuff, right? So these are just some examples that he's giving here to help us understand what he means by that, that there is a common public culture that we have that include things like women's rights, that include things like regional distinctions that we have, that are really good to protect. These are good things that we don't want to water down. We don't want to go backwards with these things. So restricting immigration, at least to levels that don't affect these to a great extent, right, would be in our best interest. Of course, someone might pipe back and say, well, but doesn't culture change anyway, right? Doesn't stuff change over time? Surely the culture that I live right now, even just individually in my own family, my wife and I, surely we live differently culturally than our parents did or their parents did. So there's a sense in which, yeah, that does happen. But at the same time, that's not the same thing as saying, or that's not assuming that it just sort of runs away with itself, right? There's a certain extent to which we have controlled it and want to stay in control of the process of cultural change when it does change, because there's a certain sort of heritage that we want to pass down to our children, the ways in which we want to raise our children and help them understand where they live and where they've come from. And being in control of the process, guiding it, directing it, right, is really important to us. Um, and I think really to all of us, frankly, right? There's reasons that we have for wanting this to move slowly, for wanting to be in control of it, so that future generations don't repeat the mistakes that previous generations themselves have committed. And sort of reason number two now, what is there a second reason, or what is the second reason that Miller has for thinking that we should limit immigration? And really, it's sort of a practical one. It's really just the anxiety that we have about population size. So think about it this way. Globally, there are all kinds of Western democracies, right? All kinds of Western societies that practice free market economics, that provide education to great extents to their people, that have basic levels of distributive justice, where people are free, where they thrive, where indeed we are coming up with more and more advancement in technology, um, as well as in education, as well as in medicine, right? I mean, as well as in the standard of living, right? So all these things play into the fact that in places like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, most European countries, Japan, even China, sort of getting there as well, especially certain places in China. Whereas these societies themselves are becoming more and more advanced, well, the standard of living goes up then, right? It's better to live nowadays where we have things like vaccines, where we have things like advanced medical treatment, where we have things like um, advanced automobiles, even the sorts of crazy technologies that are in a car that you go buy at a dealer nowadays, right? Uh, the standard of living is really high, but there's another side to that coin, where standard of living is high, the costs of that standard are high as well. So we have to spend more money to achieve those kinds of goals, to achieve these kinds of advancements that we have. And so this is what Miller means when he says resource consumption thus goes up in order to meet that standard. So in other words, it can be, in other words, around the globe, Western societies at least, compared to those that are not Western, indeed have a high standard of living, and they pay a lot to do that. If there are states, if there are countries around the world that do not have that kind of standard of living, who can just sort of get rid of people that they can't take care of already, then really they have no incentive to keep their people happy. They have no incentive to stabilize the population. They have no incentive to make sure that basic levels of living standards themselves are met. Right? We can just sort of get rid of the problem people, get rid of the people who want to reform things, send them off, ship them, pack them up, ship them off somewhere else where they can live, and then everything is good. Okay, so if that is happening globally, well, then how does that affect us nationally? What Miller wants to say is, nationally speaking, population growth can really be detrimental to cultural values, including especially the value on how to manage consumption And immigration makes this much more difficult. And the reason why it makes it more difficult, really, is because if we have a basic standard of living and there are costs associated with that, well, then the more immigrants you bring into the country, the more the price tag goes up for the rest of us. Again, public education is a really good example of this. There's a certain amount of money that we in this state pay for every student. We pay in order for every student to be educated, whatever that price tag is. I should have looked that up. I don't know what it is. I'm going to say it's around the ballpark of $8,000 per student. Now, I might be way low and I might be way high. I really don't know. I haven't looked at this in a long time. Um, but let's just say that it's $8,000. So every education, every public school student in the state, pretty much the average then is that through taxes, right? The state board of education, right? They pay these school districts $8,000 per student um, that they have. Well, what if overnight, or let's just say in the course of a year, our state gets 1 million new school-aged students times 8,000? That's a lot of money. Who's going to pay for that? Well, um, Tammy just looked it up. Okay, $8,000 per student. Okay, thank you for that. 8,762. So I was a little bit low. So $8,000, or I'm sorry, $11,000. I can't get away from my 8,000 example now, can I? $11,000 per student. If you've got 1 million students that move here within a year, that adds to it, doesn't it? It becomes much more costly now, doesn't it? So, I mean, it makes sense. The more immigrants you have, the more the price tag is going to go up on continuing to maintain the standard of living, continuing to maintain the public benefits that we all share, that we all have um, for one another. And that can be very costly. So anyway, that's all that I've really got for you today, going through this argument that Miller has presented about why he thinks it's really important that we limit immigration, why it's important that we don't have free borders. Um, what sorts of thoughts or questions does any of you have, or might any of you have, about this? Well, if there's not anything, thank you all for logging in today. Hope you've enjoyed this. And hope you all have a great rest of your week.